Rob also, as many of you know, has the leading casebook, really the first and still the premier patent law casebook, and also has a great one that he's co-authored with folks, IP in the New Technological Age, that I've used that repeatedly in IP survey classes. Just a fantastic book. He's visited at Harvard and Stanford. He's lectured, of course, all over the world. A lot of you may also know his book, Justifying IP, that came out a few years ago, which really was just a great effort to look at the philosophical underpinnings of IP. And again, taking it from our shared view of it, that IP can be beneficial. And it's good to look back and think, why do we have an IP system, and why is it incredibly helpful to creators and innovators? He's also testified numerous times in the Senate and the House, has just blue chip clients who he's consulted with. He's always in demand to help folks think through their very difficult IP positions. He has his Bachelor of Science from Carnegie Mellon, JD from Yale, and LLM and JSD from Columbia Law School. I'd like to introduce Rob Merges for our keynote speech.
You're welcome.
Okay. I want to thank Sean and everybody here at George Mason and CPIP for bringing me here, asking me to, giving me the privilege, really, of leading off what looks to be a fantastic conference. And I want to thank everybody for rolling through traffic and coming out on what looks to be a pretty spectacular day. I hope that we can make it worth your while to sit in a room and think about IP today. My topic really takes off from the conference title. It's probably not surprising that sometimes if I give a presentation, I sort of feel like I have to shoehorn something I might want to say into the format or into the theme of the conference. But that's not true here, because this topic, I think, is really an excellent summary of where a lot of IP scholarship has been heading in the last 10 or 15 years, and where I think it should be heading. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about contemporary scholarship and how it fits with this theme, this bridge theme, which I like quite a bit. I'm not surprised, because Sean and I tend to think alike about a lot of things, and I was thrilled when he said that he was coming here to George Mason. Have a great IP program already, and of course well known for law and economics, antitrust, lots of good fields. So Sean's a perfect fit. This is from the statement of the conference themes, and as I say, it could hardly be more apt in terms of summarizing a lot of what's happening in IP scholarship. So what I'm going to do is use this motif, this theme, as a way to talk a little bit about what scholars have been studying and how this orientation towards a more sophisticated and realistic view of how creative people get their ideas and their work actually into the market. The bridge or the transition or the value chain, however you want to talk about it, is a topic that a lot of scholars have become interested in. And in terms of IP scholarship, I'll try to point out, when I was trained in the earlier era with a more simplistic set of models in terms of the economics of intellectual property. And maybe some of you, if you took IP or you took patent law or even antitrust back in law school 20 or more years ago, the older theory I'm going to talk about might be familiar to you. You could think of it maybe as, Chicago School 1.0. And what I want to do is show you how a lot of contemporary scholarship has moved much closer to the real world and has a much greater emphasis and focus on this bridge theme of actually looking at how intellectual creations, intellectual ideas and products become part of real-world marketable products, how they get to market, and what the contribution of the IP component really is. And a lot of the emphasis in the literature in the recent times is on the way that IP-based products, and sometimes pure ideas, how they flow, how they move from the workshop or the lab or the creative locus, let's call it, into the real-world marketplace. And of course, that involves links on a chain. And from our point of view, from a scholarly point of view, what that means is we have to think about the organizations and the industry structure that different creative works find themselves in. And that also makes us think about transactions and the way that intellectual creations and IP rights move contractually in transactions is a really big focal point of scholarship in recent years. And that's a big change from the simplistic models of years ago. At the end of the day, what we care about in the IP field, of course, is maximizing the volume and quality of intellectual creations that consumers have access to. Now, in our field, in the intellectual property field, I think it's safe to say that the predominant emphasis in thinking about how to get the greatest number of works in front of the largest number of people, the emphasis is usually on access, and the emphasis is on thinking about IP rights, at least at times, as a barrier, as something that blocks the flow of intellectual creations into the hands of consumers. There's an older tradition, and I think some of us are still working to keep it alive, where we think about this question. For people who work in DC representing IP owners, it will be a shock to see that the IP field would care about anything but this, right? Because for a lot of us, this is how we think about the nature of the field. But in IP scholarship, the compensation question, how can creative professionals earn a living? And what kind of living do they have? And how does IP law help them, and in some cases hinder them, from actually making a living? Believe it or not, that is not a primary focus of much scholarship, believe it or not. And so at the beginning, the foot of the bridge in these fields that we're going to talk about is a person or a team that is engaged in creative work. And the care and feeding of that person or team is sometimes overlooked in IP scholarship. But if you trace the value chain all the way back and you follow the transactional chain to its origin, you'll always find a creative person. And how much money they can make, whether they can make a life as a professional, is of deep concern for some of us. And that's why I think this idea of a bridge is helpful. They need a way to get their ideas and products to market, but at the end of the day, they need to get paid for them, right? And the emphasis on access and, I'll say, a kind of public domain focus in the IP scholarship field has a long tradition, and it certainly has an important place. But I think Sean and I and some others also like to make sure people don't lose the focus on this. And the situations that creative people find themselves in and how they make a living in those situations matters to us. And that's something I want to talk about too. It takes different forms. In a lot of cases, creative people are employees. They're part of big companies. And in the IP field, you could say, if you wanted to kind of boil down, I'll call it 30% of the IP scholarship, you could kind of summarize it: big companies bad. Just put it that way. And I think that that's a mistake to be that simplistic. They're an important part of the creative ecosystem. Many of you know that, and some of you have probably had jobs where part of your work was creative output, either as an R&D employee or maybe working for an animation studio, possibly a session musician. There's thousands of jobs that involve a big company IP production. And again, I think the literature sometimes overlooks the important place. The other thing that big companies do, and I'll talk about this some more, of course, is they're part of a larger network. Very often, big companies do have employees, but they also hire a lot of independent contractors, and they buy a lot of independent content, right? So big companies are an important part of the value chain for a lot of creative people. And for some, it's their main source of a living. The other locus we see a lot of times is small teams. And by this I mean it could be a specialty technology company that has a group that specializes in some esoteric field. That can be a small group of specialist creative people. It could be a music ensemble. It could be a graphic arts shop. It could be a design house that does industrial design. There's lots of small teams that rely very heavily on intellectual property protection, and they fit into a bigger ecosystem, right? And how they fit in and how IP affects them is something that I think some of us are trying to keep attention on. And then, of course, we have independent content creators. We have the smallest of the small. They are in some ways the most vulnerable. Sometimes they are the ones who take risks, and in some fields they're a crucial part of the ecosystem. And the way intellectual property affects them in a day-to-day level is something that, again, some of us care about and have started to study in recent years. There's been some good studies of how does the average professional musician make a living? How do they keep a roof over their head and their kids in sneakers, right? And it's interesting because it turns out that to be a professional musician, for the average creative person, not the household name, you have to be sort of a jack of all trades. You do some teaching, you do some session work, you do some master classes, you teach at a community college, you do tour sometimes. As musicians get older, they tour less. And so a model where all of your income is based on live shows, I will state boldly, has a sort of age discrimination component. When you have kids, you can't be away 300 days a year, not if you want to stay married and know your kids. And so the structure of the music industry, which now emphasizes an income stream based on live performance, has become skewed. And this is just one of the ways that I think this theme of who are these people and how do they make a living and how do IP rights affect them, this is one of the ways that we've started to sort of figure out that it needs to be studied. So on the bridge theme, I think, the general point is there's a lot of different types of bridges. There's a lot of ways that creative people have their work integrated into products and brought to market, right? So I just picked some favorites of mine. One's Rialto in Venice, where I was recently. And that's near home, where I'm all the time. But the point is that there's all kinds of organizational and industry structures that creative people find themselves in. And IP law plays a slightly different role depending on what your job is and where you fit in the ecosystem. And again, that's something we have started to pay attention to more and more, right? Now again, for people who work in these fields, it's like, yeah, well, okay, this is what we do, fine, glad to hear it. But you have to realize that for intellectual property scholars, the way we were trained, the way we were raised, it was in a very abstract modeling environment where these real-world factors were quite distant from the economic theories we were taught. And so when we used to talk about the economics of intellectual property, we were talking about a pretty simple worldview that was based on fairly simple models, right? The framework that I grew up in was really often fell under this label of how do you appropriate the returns from innovation? How do you recoup your R&D investment or your investment into creative work, okay? And in this model, we had to start somewhere. I'm not critiquing Generation 1 per se, but you'll see it's fairly simplistic, and really when you think about it implicitly, it has a very simple view that you make all the investment in a creative product up front, one big lump, boom. And then you try to earn it back. You try to appropriate the returns. You try to recoup the investment, right? So implicit in the old model is a very simple two-stage time frame or time sequence. And I can point to lots of examples. One of the classic articles along this line is one of my Berkeley colleagues David Teese. And he actually was one of the first to really think a little bit about the differing situations for creative people, depending on industry structure. Who depends on collaboration, who needs to sell their ideas in a licensing market, in which industries do you make most of your returns by bundling an IP product with other kinds of assets like distribution or economies of scale. But it was still a pretty simple model, and the basic idea was, again, this sort of two-stage. And then a real classic from '88, one of the early empirical surveys. My thesis advisor, Dick Nelson from Columbia, worked on this. And this still gets cited all the time. And again, you can see from the title, it has that implicit sort of two-stage model, appropriating the returns from industrial R&D, right? So simple. You make the investment, and then you get returns, right? Two simple stages. And that's a good way to start and think about how the economics of IP should work, right? I mean, again, you got to start somewhere, and thinking about it in simple terms is a good way to start. Implicit in that is this sort of two-input model, I would say. You got ideas, possibly embodied in human capital, and then you have money, investment money. You create a finished product, and then you put it on the market, right? That's the basic model. And if you took economics, and your economics class back in the day, if you talked about innovation at all, I'm willing to bet that the professor said something like, imagine the widget industry, right? And you are going to invest in a new widget. And how are you going to appropriate the returns from your investment in a new widget, right? So that's classic, Chicago School 1.0 thinking. You can't be more abstract than making up an imaginary product. So that's about as abstract as it gets. At least they were talking about investment and thinking about IP as something in economic terms, right? But again, fairly simplistic. And the real key is that the costs are all sunk up front in the creation of a final finished creative work, and then you kind of throw it over the fence to the money-making people and see how much you can make back, right? That's the basic model. And back in this era, you sometimes heard people talk about what they used to call the L-shaped marginal cost curve, right? This is the idea that the cost for the first copy of a Star Wars movie is millions of dollars. And given digital distribution and file sharing, the cost of every other copy is essentially zero. So you have one copy that's really expensive, the original one. You'll sometimes see the same model discussed in pharma, right? Getting that active ingredient actually proven to work and not kill people and do something good, at least marginally. The first one costs you, $1 billion. And then since manufacturing is trivial and straightforward in this model, every other copy of the pill is essentially zero marginal cost, right? So you see this kind of thinking, again, in the older literature. Nothing wrong with it per se as a starting point, but you can see how unrealistic it is based on real-world business models, right? And a lot of the contemporary scholarship is just catching up and trying to be more analytic and pay more attention to what happens in the real world. This is not really what happens in the real world, right? Very few products have this giant sunk cost up front structure. There's actually a much more staged and sequenced set of events. We can do better in thinking about how IP works if we're more realistic about that sequence of events. So, the conventional story is, well, gee, because of the L-shaped marginal cost curve, if I don't have IP protection, then my first copy, which costs $1 billion, and every other copy at marginal cost is zero, I'll lose my shirt because no one will allow me to earn back that $1 billion. They're all going to want me to price at marginal cost, which is zero or close to it, and so I'll lose all my investment, right? And so the fast follower who copies my product and doesn't spend the $1 billion, his or her marginal cost for every unit they make is zero. They don't have the initial $1 billion investment because they copied mine, right? So that's the thinking. And so in order to protect against that, the conventional story is we have IP rights. Again, the notion is you won't make the sunk cost upfront investment without having an IP right that you know will allow you to recoup returns in period 2. So it's a simple, 2-period structure. That's the basic sequence. Okay, so in what way have we moved away from that? In what way have we started to show a little more complexity in our thinking about IP rights? Probably the first way that we have is, again, taught to us from the real world, particularly in patents, but in other areas too. And that is that, for the most part, many companies don't make final products. They don't make products that are sold into a consumer market. A lot of, especially smaller and medium-sized companies, make components that are bundled and put together in marketable products, right? And that changes the analysis quite a bit. Because if you're a component maker, you have to integrate yourself into an ecosystem with other components and other inputs. And your costs are not the only determinant of the final product price. And you have to put yourself into a value chain where the value of your component and your contribution has to be negotiated and determined, right? And so the role of IP rights then is really a role that supports the transactions that allow you to get your component integrated into a bigger product, which is then sold on a product market, right? So it's a more multi-stage kind of a process. And we think about production in a lot of industries. This is just intuitive. We know this. It follows this form. Most components in a mobile phone are made by all kinds of companies all over the world, right? If you ever looked at the value chain and the bill of manufacture for an iPhone, for example, there's, I think, 15 or 20 different countries involved and 40 or 50, maybe 60 companies. The integration of the product of the components into a final product is crucial in those businesses, right? And so having a patent on their component is very different from having a patent on a widget which is sold in the widget market. It's a very different sort of economic structure that you're working in. And the last point that I'll make is that in the old simple 2-stage model, you created a product and it was magically sort of distributed to everybody who might want it, right? You just kind of imagine throwing it over the fence after the R&D lab finishes it, and then you go through this exercise called recoupment or appropriation. There's no room in that model for the absolutely crucial step of investing in distribution assets and in building a distribution chain, right? That is, in fact, a crucial step in marketing a lot of products. And the role that IP plays in supporting that development activity, the scaling up and the distribution stage, is something that people have started to pay attention to in recent years. So it's very different than the simple 2-stage model, right? You're talking about multiple components that are bundled in transactions. They're produced by different companies. They're pulled together in final products that are sold in complex distribution chains. And if you want to get even more realistic, there's international trade and export activity that goes on because the markets are worldwide, right? So all these things are things that the IP scholarship is trying to learn about and trying to model in a more realistic kind of a way. The way it really works is, in fact, the idea and money inputs in the original intellectual creation are pretty small compared to the later stage investments, right? The biggest investment often, especially with consumer products, comes after the initial idea, the prototype is worked out. And a lot of the really big costs are in scaling it up, marketing it, and distributing it. And the way that IP fits into that is something that scholars have started to pay much more attention to in recent years. Just a couple points about that. You're obviously going to be more concerned about manufacturing and the process patents that are related to that, if you care about scaling up and if you care about the development phase. And if you are interested in marketing and distribution, the role of trademarks and branding becomes absolutely crucial, right? So one of the really big, I think, steps forward in the IP field in recent years is that trademarks, in terms of the bundle of IP rights, were a kind of distant third for many years in IP theory and in IP scholarship, right? the kind of the big two were copyright and patent, pretty much in that order. The interest in trademarks and the interest in the way that companies use branding to build distribution and to build consumer loyalty, that's becoming a much more important focus in the intellectual property scholarship. And that reflects the real world in a much more realistic way. Trademarks are hardly a distant third. For many companies, the brand value that they build and the way that emphasis and the way that supports their marketing and sales activity, that may be the most important IP right they have. Nike has lots of design patents and many, many utility patents on running shoes, but the swoosh trademark is probably its single most valuable piece of IP, right? And the way they build that into branding is, it's a model for lots of other businesses. The point is that you can see that this kind of a bridge is a more sophisticated and multi-stage bridge. It's not a simple toss it over the fence and make money. There are a series of transactions and there are a series of business functions that are involved that we didn't capture in the older models and that we didn't know how to think about, right? And so what IP scholarship is doing really more and more these days is looking at context. Where's a creative idea originated, but then how does it reach the market? And that's all the question, that's all a matter of these bridges that we're talking about. It's all a matter of how do you get it out of the initial creative moment and actually get it into the hands of people in a usable form, right? There's a different role for IP rights when you're thinking about the development process, scale up, production, and distribution. The original design, imagine it as just like creating the blueprint. The original design, as I say, from a cost point of view, might be relatively small. The big expenses might be in figuring out how to make many, many million copies of it in a reliable way, how to keep them from breaking or breaking down as you move through the distribution chain, and then getting it into the hands of people in a usable form. The investments in all those activities, right? You take the blueprint and you say, now how do we turn this into a commercial product? The blueprint's a relatively small part. The bigger parts are these subsequent stages. And this is what a lot of IP scholarship is moving toward now, right? So we ask questions like, where in the chain of events does the creative person reside? At what stage do we have the idea? And then how is it packaged, combined, and put on that bridge until it reaches the consumer at the end stage, right? These are different types of incentives that we need, and they're different types of investments. So just to take one example of what this has meant for my field, for patent law, my primary field. In the widget model, you would say, okay, we want to protect the investment in making a new widget. Okay, so we're going to give a monopoly on a widget. And that means that the Mergis Widget Company is the only one who can sell widgets. They have a monopoly in the product market, right? Antitrust people for a long time took that kind of simple view of patents. Patents are monopolies, right? In the real world, especially if you're talking about the typical situation where patents cover components, or let's be realistic, aspects of components, parts of components, to talk about a patent as a monopoly right is just ridiculous, To say that I've got a patent on the way that the antenna is integrated into the upload chip on my iPhone. That's a long, 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 long way from saying I have a monopoly on the iPhone, right? A long way. Small component. So in the contemporary way we think about patents, we usually talk about portfolios rather than individual patents. And we talk about whether and to what extent your portfolio might protect some revenue streams and some profit margins. That's a long way from saying that a patent is a monopoly, right? The patent as a monopoly imagines that you have a single patent that covers a product which is sold in a direct consumer market. The real world doesn't work that way. Most patents are on small aspects of components that are integrated into bigger products. Very, very, very few patents confer an actual economic monopoly on anybody. They may give you some power, some pricing power. They may allow you to protect your profit margin, okay? They may deviate slightly from a perfect competition model in that you can recoup some of your investment and you can make some money and you can convince a mobile phone company to buy your component instead of somebody else's, and you can price it just a little higher than the last generation. That's all it really gives you. That's a long way from saying that a patent is a monopoly. That's just one very simple version of the story. The other reason we focus on portfolios is that you want to see not only do you have a patent on the blueprint, but can you protect your investment in the scaling up, in the production? Can you protect your investment in branding? Can you protect your investment in a distribution network, right? And that takes a lot of different forms. Of course, on the branding side, we may be talking about your portfolio of trademarks. Do you have a family of trademarks that covers all your related products? If you have a family, especially if they have some kind of international resonance, then you may have a valuable brand and you can build around it. The other way that we protect investment and distribution, of course, is through trade secret law, where the human capital in marketing professionals and the human capital in people who are good at building distribution networks can be protected from having it walk out the door, right? So you want to think of IP the way a business does, which is not just in silos, patent, copyright, trademark, but all IP rights. And you want to think of it as covering different types of investments at different stages. And just to add another point to it, if you take a more variegated model where investment happens not all at once up front, but in a sequential way, then you're starting to think about IP rights more as options, where perhaps at the next stage I want to invest in some IP because it may give me some flexibility down the road, right? And so the idea of thinking about IP as one of the way you protect your options for the future, the way you keep flexibility in a multi-stage, multi-sequence model, that's also an aspect of IP theory that's become more prominent in recent years. And again, an option is a very different way to think about an IP right than a monopoly, right? An option is all about, I'm not sure what's going to happen. It's a dynamic path. The bridge is long and winding. I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know which of my blueprints are going to turn out to be the important one when we scale it up. Which one will hold together better? Which will fit with other people's components better? We don't know that at the outset, so we get a bundle of patents, a portfolio, and that gives us options. And I don't have time to go into it, but another aspect of this that's important in the real world is the secondary market for patents, because sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you need some IP protection and you don't have time to generate it in-house. Patents have a long lead time. And so the secondary market can be a way you fill in a gap in your portfolio to provide a crucial flexibility or a crucial piece of leverage you need at a certain stage, right? That's far from the initial simple two-stage model. There would be very little room for a secondary market for patents in a two-stage model because you know everything you need to know up front and you make your investment and you try to make it back. Really, a lot of what I'm talking about is the role of IP in capital formation. In the simple model, you simply have a bunch of capital and you make a decision whether to invest in a research project or not. And IP doesn't play a very dynamic role in the investment process. It's just, can I make back my investment, right? So I have a bunch of money and I have talented people. Do I combine them at stage one? And the answer to that depends on, can I earn it back in stage two? Again, in the real world, it's a much more dynamic, linear sequence of events. And so the role of IP in attracting capital so that you can take a few steps on the bridge is crucial. And it's something that was missed in the old model because the simple two-stage model is you have capital already. Well, there's the old joke about, economists, stuck on a desert island and, the punchline is you turn to the economist and so the story is a can of soup washes up on the beach, and you're going along various ways to how to solve the problem of getting it open. And you turn to the economist and he or she says, well, assume we have a can opener, right? That's the old joke. Okay. Ha ha. The point is that you can't assume a whole bunch of capital. You have to create it. You have to make it happen, right? And the role of IP in attracting capital is something that the literature has started to take very seriously. And this is a really good example of a multi-stage model, right? So you have an idea. You have a creative team. And the way these studies work is they say, how does your creative team make a small initial investment and from that attract capital for the scale-up, development, and distribution phase, right? It doesn't assume a bunch of money, which you can invest at stage one. It's realistic in saying, we don't have the money. What we have is an idea. How do we get from where we are with an idea to the place where we have enough money to scale it up? Let's not just assume it. That doesn't help us. We need to actually make it happen, right? So these are studies that look at the way IP rights, in particular in the early studies anyway, patents, contribute to capital formation. How does having a patent or a portfolio of patents help a small company attract investment capital, right? And there's a lot of versions of this, but what you'll see consistently is a story like this one. This was a study based on patent activity in the early 2000s. The simple version of what these studies are teaching us is that money people, private equity, venture capital, angel investors, they really like startups that have some IP. And when you can show them that you have some intellectual property, your chances of getting funded and getting funded in a realistic way go up. Pretty simple story, okay? But again, it's well beyond what we used to model in that simple two-stage model. Now we're talking about how does IP help you start to cross the bridge? How do you cross what we call in Silicon Valley the valley of death? The valley of death is it's easy to get the first 75 grand or 125 grand from your credit card, your second mortgage, and your best friend's parents. It's really hard to get the first grown-up, serious, big money investment. Seed money, Series A, $1, $2, $3, $5 million. That's a lot different from the 125 grand you can pull together. And most small companies, most gleam in the eye companies die before they get that $2, $3, $5 million investment. That's why it's called the valley of death. Most companies don't cross it and survive. They just croak. But IP rights help you cross that divide, right? And it turns out money people care that you can protect the profit margin or the uniqueness of your creative concept with some IP rights. They really care about that. Because they know if you really are onto something, before long, big companies will come upon it. If they can easily copy what you're doing or work around it, they will. And nobody will invest in a company that is going to be easily avoided by the big players, right? Another study pretty much along the same lines. This is another study that looks at startup financing in different forms. Angel investors, private equity, venture capital. And here, the role of patents as a signal, signaling that you're sophisticated, number one. Number two, you have something that's at least unique enough to get some IP through the patent office. So some neutral third party somewhere has said there may be something here. Now we know that the patent office can't do a perfect job examining every patent. Investors know that. But especially if you have a couple of patents, and especially if it looks like the claims are pretty broad, that sends a signal. First, you know what you're doing. And second of all, if they invest, they might actually be able to get a decent return because you may be able to protect what's unique in your product idea, right? There may be something in your product idea that is valuable that other people can't easily copy. It's not just true in the U.S. Some research in continental Europe shows pretty much the same result. Now, it's harder to get a patent in Europe. And an interesting question that we have going forward is when we look at small companies and we look at their international patent portfolio, what does it tell us when they have patents not only in the US, but also in China and Europe, possibly Japan, or a country like Korea? That sends an even more sophisticated signal that you've got big plans. And if you have a number of European patents, sometimes that sends a higher quality signal, because everybody knows it's harder to get a patent in Europe. And so there might be more to your idea if you have some European patents. So some studies have looked into that. The sort of the granddaddy of this body of work is something I participated in, coming up on 10 years ago now. And in this study, we weren't as comprehensive as some of the newer ones, but we just looked mostly in biotech and software infotech at this time. And we found that just in looking across a broad sample of startup companies that most of them had at least some IP. These are averages. Now, many companies had 0 patents, but the average number across the whole sample was almost 5. But the average venture-backed company had closer to 20 patents. And so again, even for small companies, the unit of analysis is the patent portfolio, not the single patent. Very rarely does a single patent move the needle even for a small company, right? But what it shows is venture capital flows to companies that have better protection. And of course, it also shows that when you have venture capital money, you can enhance your patent portfolio. So there's some co-determination going on here. I have IP, so I get money so I get more IP. And we've all seen that in our, if you work at representing small companies, you've seen that happy feedback loop, right? And then we asked, in a questionnaire basis, we asked finance people directly. We asked venture capitalists, private equity, angel investors, and most of them, as we expected, said, yeah, we look at patents. They're very important. One of the classes that I teach at Berkeley is a class where we take submissions from life science startups, companies that are trying to get their first round of financing. And I will pair up a student with a practicing lawyer, and they'll do what we call a freedom to operate analysis. This is not an exercise in taking a small company and getting patents on their ideas. This is an exercise in looking to see what the big players in the industry have and whether it's going to block what you want to do, right? Because one of the things investors say repeatedly, and it came up in our survey data 10 years ago, the catchphrase is, we don't want to invest in a lawsuit. So they like it when a startup has IP, but they don't like it when a startup is entering into a field where big companies have a lot of patents already, right? Because what you'll do is walk right into a minefield. And so your Series A investment, 2 million, 3 million, 5 million, it's going to be swallowed up in one patent litigation, as we know. Not unusual for that to cost $1 million, right? And so a freedom to operate analysis looks at what the big players in the industry already have and whether you can fit in a niche, whether your product idea can work around and escape from and get away from where the big guys have their IP. So you do what we call an IP landscape, and you look and see where the big players have IP. Another aspect of that is, to return to that transactional theme, sometimes you can identify a piece of IP out there and you can get a license to it. If it's owned by a university or research institute, you might license it. Sometimes you can work out a deal with that IP owner and say, let's pool our resources, see if we can do some joint research together. So there are some transactional solutions when you run into a freedom to operate problem. These are things I've already talked about. People are paying more attention to the role of IP rights, particularly patents, in structuring these transactions. How does a medium-sized company use its patents to help protect its revenue stream, its profit margin, in selling a component to a bigger company which is bundled into a product and sold on a market? Okay, that's become, I think, more and more an emphasis. This emphasis on creative professionals is another aspect of this. To go back to the foot of the bridge story and a point that I made earlier, how do we provide for the care and feeding of professional people. Well, this is something I talked a lot about in this book that Sean mentioned. And one of the chapters in the book is really all about creative professionals. It's creative professionals, corporate ownership, and transaction costs. And this was an attempt to look and see where creative people are situated in different industries, and to talk a little bit about the way that IP plays a role, what the role that IP plays in their compensation and sort of in their professional advancement. One of the issues that comes up a lot when we think about where creative people are located is whether or not you can sell a component in a way that will allow it to be integrated into bigger products, right? Can you sell a component in a way where you could make some money and still constitute yourself as a separate independent team, right? This is really a question of, if you're going to do a certain sort of task, do you have to be employed in a big company? And sometimes the answer is yes. You're only going to be viable in your field working for a big company. Sometimes you can break out, form a specialized team or a specialized company, and make a go of it. And I'm running out of time, so I don't have too much time to talk about this. But one of the movements that has been popular in the business school world is this idea of modular design as facilitating smaller and independent production teams, right? And it takes different forms. I'll just say that open source is a good example of a modular design that allows people to spin off and do an app rather than have all apps produced by big giant companies, okay? And there are other examples of that too. To some extent, technical standards facilitate this kind of modular design. That's a special set of problems. I'm essentially out of time, so let me run very quickly through an example of what I'm talking about, and I hope they don't drag me off. I want to just compare two creative ecosystems to show what I mean by focusing on the different contexts that people have in their creative work, right? So one is large-scale animation. This is Studio Ghibli in Tokyo. Nickelodean is another example. We know Disney and Pixar are very famous examples. In these fields, because the product is such a piece of teamwork, because your individual drawing of a character or your individual drawing of a background absolutely must be integrated with a lot of other people's work. The only real way to organize big-time animation is with employees in big teams. And the work-for-hire doctrine in copyright law is really designed to facilitate that kind of production. And the work-for-hire doctrine basically just says, you know, if you are involved in an industry like this where your work is necessarily going to have to be joined in a very deep way with a bunch of other people's work, then the company that employs you is going to own it. And that's the structure of that. And that just means that you can constitute a division. You could have the background team, or you could have the nature team, or you could have the team that works on a certain character or a certain animal. But they're going to have to be integrated into a bigger structure. That's just the nature of it. Another type of creative work where a different structure is possible is in the field of title design. So there are actually companies that specialize in titles. When you see the beginning of a film or you see the trailer for a film, the title and the trailer are put together very carefully to sort of create an image of the film. Title design can be done by small teams independently. It doesn't have to be integrated into a big company like Pixar or Disney. And there are a lot of independent title studios. And that's because they can sell their work product as a pretty discrete unit. It doesn't have to be integrated with everybody else's work. They obviously need a license in order to get the shots they want to use. But the building of an impression and a brand and the design of the titles can be done by an independent company, right? And here, obviously, work for hire or automatic ownership would work against the interest of these companies. These are independent contractors and want to remain independent. So for them, having a separate copyright, which is a derivative work, but they own it, is important. That's the way they make their money as independents. And there's actually a bunch of companies like this. One's called Imaginary Forces, and they've done a lot of this kind of title. The structure here is that they can break out and constitute themselves as an independent team, okay? And I just use this as one example among many, that to pay attention to where creative people live, where they work, and what the value chain for their kind of work is. And we have a lot of different doctrines and structures in IP law. Work for hire is important in the Pixar Disney setting, but it wouldn't be effective for title designers. Small teams need to have portfolio of patents on their specialized components, but they need to integrate them into bigger products, okay? So again, I'm over my time, but I'm just going to restate the general theme, which is we're a long way away from a very simple, let's imagine a market for widgets, and let's give a monopoly on widgets, okay? And the direction of IP scholarship, I think, is more and more in this, along this trajectory, which is what's happening in the real world. How do people actually make money with what they do? There are some signs for hope that this is starting to have an effect in the policy world. I don't have very much time to talk about it, but in the music field, just in the last year, I think we've finally come around to the fact that the compensation model for streaming was broken, right? Individual artists weren't making any money on streaming. And we also realized, certainly the Europeans did, that a lot of independent content creators were getting steamrolled and crushed by the big platform companies. And so the copyright directive in Europe from the last year is really aimed directly at trying to resuscitate and revitalize independent content creators, including journalists, who for the first time people are seeing as important creative contributors, and the care and feeding of journalism is an important public policy issue, right? We never had to think about that before because of the business model they had was working. Well, it's not. And to the extent that revenue is flowing up to the platforms, in Europe they've said we need to take action and do something about this, right? These are all examples of saying, let's pay attention to where creative people really work and how the legal structure affects their income stream. And, let's just be blunt about it. Let's make sure that these people can make a living doing their creative work. We all benefit when they do. So these models and this way of thinking is not just more interesting intellectually. It has real policy payoff. If we pay attention to the real world structures of IP creation and compensation, we're going to help create a more beneficial feedback for public policy. We have more useful things to say, right? Because I don't want to sit in a Senate hearing and say, well, imagine a market for widgets and imagine we have all the money we need for an upfront investment. It doesn't help anybody. They're looking and they're saying, what's a widget? Who is this guy? Get him out of here. Send him back to Berkeley. Right? You want to know how do real creators actually make money and how can we help them? What are the legal structures we need to have in place to help them? How can we do better? That's what this body of work is really all about. Anyway, I have overstayed my welcome. You have very kindly not dragged me off stage, which I appreciate. And I hope we have time to talk about this stuff. You can grab me afterwards, tell me that I was boring, wrong, stupid, or off point. That's fine. Anyway, I appreciate the chance to blab about this stuff, which I always like to do. Okay.